It's a peculiar thing, watching seven figures materialize in your crypto wallet because a former reality TV star turned leader of the free world decided to launch a digital token with his face plastered across it. Life has a twisted sense of humor that way, serving up fortune on the back of absurdity like some cosmic chef who specializes in ironic canapes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Max Lerner, and until 8 months ago I was just another 30-something crypto trader living in a converted industrial loft in Austin that screamed, "I have opinions about Japanese denim and obscure bourbon," far louder than I was comfortable with. I'd spent 5 years riding the ridiculous roller coaster of cryptocurrency, experiencing the stomach-dropping plunges and exhilarating climbs with the peculiar mix of dread and euphoria that only degenerate gamblers and crypto enthusiasts can truly understand. My friends in traditional finance, those poor souls shackled to Bloomberg terminals and actuarial tables, constantly reminded me that crypto wasn't real investing. They said this while conveniently forgetting that the entire global financial system essentially runs on collective fiction and agreement, just with better tailoring and more expensive office furniture. It's digital monopoly money. My father, a retired accountant with a pathological trust in treasury bonds, would say during our bi-weekly phone calls, "No intrinsic value." But here's the thing about intrinsic value. It's surprisingly flexible when enough people decide something matters, like presidential tokens, apparently. When the former and apparently future president announced his own cryptocurrency, Trump, because subtlety has never been the man's strong suit, I bought in for the same reason I do most things: a potent mixture of curiosity, contrarianism, and chronic inability to resist a narrative that seemed too absurd to ignore. I didn't invest my life savings or anything dramatically reckless, just enough to make it interesting, like betting on a racehorse because you like its name. What I didn't anticipate was that Trump would explode like a supernova of nationalist fervor and investment FOMO, appreciating 12,800% in 48 hours after launch. Suddenly, my moderately interesting position transformed into the kind of money that makes you stare at your screen, blinking rapidly, wondering if you're having a stroke or if that many zeros could possibly be real. Let me be clear. I'm not a MAGA guy. My politics lean more toward, can't we all just calm down and fund libraries properly? But I've always maintained that successful trading isn't about personal conviction. It's about accurately predicting other people's convictions. And if there's one thing I've learned in the past several years, it's that underestimating the conviction of certain segments of the American populace is a losing strategy. So there I was, suddenly wealthy in that distinctly modern way where the money exists but doesn't really exist, caught in the quantum uncertainty of crypto where you're simultaneously rich and not rich until you attempt to convert your digital tokens into something you can actually, use. The responsible thing would have been to immediately liquidate half my position, diversify into boring investments, set aside money for taxes, and perhaps buy a slightly nicer Japanese denim jacket. Instead, I bought a yacht. In my defense, it wasn't an oligarch-sized yacht, more of a successful orthodontist having a midlife crisis yacht. 42 feet of gleaming white fiberglass with teak accents that I named Proof of Stake, a crypto joke that exactly 3 people ever understood, but which amused me enormously every time I looked at the stern. That yacht turned out to be Chekhov's gun in the story of my life. If you introduce a luxury boat in the first act, someone is definitely going to try to rob you by the third. Met Eliza at a crypto conference in Miami, which is exactly the kind of sentence that would have made absolutely no sense 15 years ago, but now seems almost tediously conventional. The conference was one of those events that combines genuine innovation with breathtaking bullshit in roughly equal measure, all wrapped in the peculiar aesthetic of new money trying desperately to look like old money but with LED wristbands. She was standing by a display for some DeFi protocol promising to revolutionize cross-border micropayments, looking at the animated graphics with the bemused expression of someone watching a dog trying to use a doorknob. Intrigued, but fundamentally skeptical. It's like watching financial interpretive dance, isn't it? I said, instantly regretting the line, but apparently unable to stop myself from verbalizing every half-formed thought around attractive women. To my surprise, she laughed. Not the polite acknowledgement of someone trapped in unwanted conversation, but a genuine laugh that suggested I had articulated something she'd been thinking. I was just wondering if all the animated coins flying around are supposed to represent actual value or just the founder's hopes and dreams, she replied. And just like that, we were talking, really talking, not just exchanging the ritualistic, verbal handshakes of conference networking. Eliza Kwan was smart, funny, and possessed the rare quality of being able to call something absurd without being cynical about it. She worked in strategic communications for several crypto projects, which in any other industry would be called PR, but in crypto gets rebranded as something that sounds more technical and therefore justifies a higher hourly rate. What struck me most about Eliza wasn't her obvious intelligence or even her beauty, though she had both in quantities that made me constantly aware of the statistical improbability of her giving me the time of day. It was her apparent immunity to the particular strain of delusion that infects most people in the crypto space. That uniquely modern conviction that we're all just one good token launch away from revolutionizing human civilization and/or becoming billionaires, whichever comes first. Most of these projects will fail spectacularly, she said matter-of-factly over overpriced cocktails at the conference hotel bar. But the ones that don't, she shrugged, those might actually matter. So you're a realistic optimist, I said. Rare breed in these parts. I prefer pragmatic fantasist, she corrected with a smile that did something complicated to my internal organs. Firmly rooted in reality while maintaining a flexible relationship with possibility. Over the next 3 days we became conference partners, navigating the panels and parties as a unit, developing the kind of shorthand that usually takes months to establish. By the time I mentioned my yacht was docked nearby, the invitation to see it felt like the natural next step rather than the painfully transparent ploy it objectively was. Proof of stake? She read the name off the stern with a raised eyebrow. Confident naming choice. It was either that or bad decisions made right, I admitted, helping her aboard. Miami from the water is a different city, all glittering possibility, and artistic lighting. The less photogenic realities blurred into abstraction by distance and sea breeze. We drank chilled white wine on the deck as the skyline performed its nightly illumination ritual, and I found myself telling Eliza things I rarely shared, about growing up with my precision-oriented accountant father and chronically spontaneous artist mother, about the tension between security and adventure that had defined my life choices, about the strange, untethered feeling of sudden wealth. It's like being handed a key without knowing which door it opens, I said, surprising myself with the disclosure. Everyone acts like money solves everything, but mostly it just gives you more elaborate problems and the nagging suspicion you're doing wealth wrong. The burden of optionality, she nodded. When you can theoretically do anything, the weight of choosing becomes paralyzing. Exactly, I said, feeling that peculiar relief of being understood. How are you so good at this? At what? Translating? The garbled static in my head into actual coherent concepts. She laughed again, that genuine laugh that made me want to keep amusing her indefinitely. Hazard of the communications job. I spend my days turning developer gibberish into human language. You're actually refreshingly straightforward. I won't bore you with the details of what happened next. Partly out of gentlemanly discretion, but mostly because the mechanics are less interesting than the meaning. What matters is that by morning, watching the sun fracture into diamonds across Biscayne Bay, I was already halfway to believing in the kind of cosmic significance that I usually mocked in others. I should get going, Eliza said, gathering her things with a reluctance that felt gratifyingly mutual. Or you could not, I suggested, immediately adding, I mean, the conference is over. We could take the yacht down to the Keys for a few days. If you don't have to rush back to— Where is it you live, actually? San Francisco, theoretically. But I haven't been home in weeks. She hesitated, her expression shifting through several calculations I couldn't quite decode. A few days in. The Keys sound suspiciously like the kind of spontaneous decision I should say no to. Absolutely, I agreed. very irresponsible, hardly knowing each other, totally reckless, completely inadvisable. She nodded solemnly. So that's a yes? Her smile was answer enough. Those few days stretched into a week, then 2. The Keys became Puerto Rico, then the Virgin Islands. Time developed an elastic quality, measured in sunsets and conversations rather than deadlines or commitments. We fell into a rhythm that felt both novel and somehow familiar, as if we were remembering rather than discovering how to be together. It sounds like a luxury travel Instagram fever dream, I realize. Wealthy crypto guy, beautiful woman, island, hopping on a yacht. All that's missing is an inspirational quote in a cursive font, but beneath the admittedly privileged surface was something that felt real in a way my sudden wealth never had. Eliza challenged me, made me laugh, called me on my occasional bullshit, and seemed genuinely unimpressed by the financial windfall that had most other people in my life treating me like I'd somehow become more interesting by virtue of additional zeros in my accounts. A month into our impromptu adventure, anchored in a secluded bay off St. John, I did the thing that everyone with an ounce of common sense knows you absolutely should not do after knowing someone for such a cosmically insignificant period of time. I proposed. In my partial defense, it wasn't planned. We were snorkeling near the boat when Eliza surfaced, holding something she'd found on the sandy bottom. A perfect spiral shell, mathematics made manifest in calcium carbonate. It's a chambered nautilus, she said, water droplets catching sunlight on her eyelashes. The golden ratio in nature, sacred geometry. And looking at her in that moment, excited about mathematical principles embedded in marine biology, somehow managing to be simultaneously intellectual and joyful, I experienced a certainty I'd never felt about anything that couldn't be verified on a blockchain. "Marry me," I said, immediately wondering if salt water had somehow seeped into my brain and short-circuited my rational faculties. Eliza froze, her expression transitioning from delight about the shell to something more complex. That's either the most romantic or the most insane thing anyone's ever said to me, she replied after a pause that redefined my understanding of temporal relativity. Why choose? I offered. The best decisions usually live in that intersection. What followed was a conversation too nuanced for perfect recall, one that included all the rational objections: too soon, barely know each other, different lives, in different cities, and nonetheless concluded with the irrational outcome. By sunset, Eliza was wearing a ring fashioned from a piece of nautilus shell and thin gold wire I'd had on the boat, a temporary placeholder that somehow felt more significant than any diamond could have. We were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony on the beach in St. Thomas, witnessed by the yacht's captain and a handful of local friends Eliza had somehow managed to make during our brief time there. I remember thinking how remarkably efficient she was at establishing connections, a skill I'd always found challenging, to finding treasures in unexpected places. She toasted at our impromptu reception, eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my chest constrict with something between happiness and terror. Life developed a dreamlike quality after that. Island. Mornings that stretched into lazy afternoons, evenings spent planning our future between tangled sheets and half-empty wine glasses. We'd return to the mainland soon, we agreed. Find a place together. Maybe Austin. Maybe San Francisco. Maybe somewhere entirely new. The specific geography seemed less important than the fact that we'd navigate it together. "I've never been this happy," I told her one night. The kind of declaration that tempts fate so blatantly it should come with a warning label. Eliza's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Me neither," she said, and something in her tone should have registered as dissonant. But I was too saturated with contentment to hear it properly. The dissonance became impossible to ignore 3 days later, when Eliza's phone chimed with a text as we were having breakfast on the deck. She glanced at it, and I watched her face perform a complex series of micro-expressions, too rapid to interpret but significant enough to notice. "Everything okay?" I asked. Fine, she said, putting the phone screen down with deliberate casualness. Just an old friend who happens to be in St. Thomas for work. What incredible timing, right? He wants to grab coffee and catch up. An old friend, I repeated, hating the note of question that crept into my voice despite my best efforts at nonchalance. Jason, she supplied, buttering a piece of toast with excessive focus. We went to high school together in San Francisco. Haven't seen him in years. There's a particular feeling, a disturbance in the force, if you will, that registers when someone you know intimately isn't being entirely forthcoming. It's not quite suspicion, more like recognition of negative space, the outline of something, deliberately omitted. I'd love to meet him, I said, testing the waters. Eliza's knife paused mid-spread. Oh, it would be so boring for you, just ancient history and people you don't know. Why don't you use the time to check on your investments? You've been saying you need to rebalance your portfolio. Which was true, and also the kind of perfectly reasonable suggestion that nonetheless sets off alarm bells when offered with such specific, alternative activities. Sure, I agreed, mentally calculating how quickly I could follow her once she left the boat. I'm not proud of what happened next. I'd like to tell you I respected my new wife's privacy and trusted in our connection. I'd like to tell you I focused on my crypto portfolio like a responsible adult. I'd like to tell you a lot of things that would make me sound better than I actually am. Instead, I waited 15 minutes after Eliza departed for her coffee date, then followed her to a beachfront cafe where I observed from behind a strategically positioned newspaper like some middle-aged protagonist in a mediocre spy novel. Jason turned out to be tall, conventionally handsome in that generically athletic way, and approximately as old-school friend-like as a great white shark is vegetarian. The moment I saw them together, the familiar way his hand lingered on her lower back, the intimate lean of their heads in conversation, I knew with sickening certainty that I was looking at something beyond friendship. But it was what happened next that truly unmoored me. I watched as Jason handed her what appeared to be a small USB drive, which she quickly tucked into her purse. Their conversation became more animated, involving hand gestures that suggested disagreement or possibly strategic planning. At one point, Jason pulled out his phone and showed Eliza something on the screen that made her expression harden momentarily before she nodded with apparent reluctance. I didn't confront them. I didn't dramatically reveal myself or create a scene worthy of reality television. I simply returned to the yacht, heart pounding with a toxic mixture of bewilderment and betrayal, and waited for whatever came next. Eliza returned 2 hours later, cheeks flushed from the island heat, and what I now suspected was the particular adrenaline that comes from deception. "How is your friend?" I asked, aiming for casual and probably missing by several nautical miles. "Good," she replied with manufactured brightness. "So strange seeing him after all this time. Small world, right?" "Microscopic," I agreed. "What does Jason do again? You didn't mention." The hesitation was brief, but unmistakable. "He's in tech. Security consulting, actually." "Fascinating field," I nodded. "Lots of opportunities for someone with the right access." Something flickered in her eyes, recognition that this conversation was operating on multiple levels. For a moment I thought she might confess, might offer some explanation that would make sense of what I'd witnessed. Instead, she did something worse. She doubled down. "You know what we should do?" she said, voice warming with apparent spontaneity. "We should head back to Miami tomorrow. I'm feeling ready to start our real life together. Find a place, maybe. Look into investment opportunities as a couple. What do you think?" What I thought was that my new wife was plotting something with her not-so-old friend that almost certainly involved separating me from my cryptocurrency holdings. What I said was, "Sounds perfect." That night, while Eliza slept beside me, or pretended to, I silently extracted myself from bed and accessed her purse, finding the USB drive tucked into an interior pocket. My hands shook slightly as I plugged it into my laptop, unsure what I expected to find. What I discovered was worse than I'd imagined. A sophisticated script designed to extract private keys from a digital wallet, along with detailed notes on my specific holdings and security practices. information I'd shared with Eliza during our weeks together, never imagining she was cataloging my potential vulnerabilities rather than getting to know her new husband. There were also messages between her and Jason dating back to before the Miami conference where we'd met. Messages that made it abundantly clear our chance encounter had been meticulously planned, that she'd researched me thoroughly after my Trump windfall made headlines in crypto circles, that Jason wasn't just her partner in crime, but her partner, period. Target acquired, she'd messaged him after our first night together. Proceeding to phase 2. The clinical detachment of those words felt like ice water in my veins. I'd been a mark, nothing more than a wealthy target for a sophisticated scam. Our entire relationship, from meet-cute to marriage, had been an elaborate con designed to separate me from my digital fortune. I closed the laptop, replaced the USB drive exactly as I'd found it, and returned to bed beside the beautiful stranger, who wore my improvised ring and had never really existed at all. Sleep eluded me as I cycled through the stages of betrayal, shock, anger, bargaining with reality, and finally, somewhere around 4 a.m., a strange clarity that felt almost like peace. By sunrise I had a plan. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told Eliza over coffee the next morning, "about starting our real life together. I agree completely." Her smile was radiant with apparent relief. "I'm so glad. I was worried you might want to stay on the boat indefinitely." "Actually," I said, measuring my words carefully, "I've been considering a significant portfolio consolidation. Moving everything into cold storage, one secure location, maximum protection." I watched her eyes widen slightly, with poorly concealed interest. "That sounds sensible. Would you need help with that?" "I was hoping you'd ask," I said, reaching for her hand across the table. "I trust you completely, and 2 sets of eyes are always better than one for security. We could do it together once we're back in Miami." The way her fingers tightened around mine felt like confirmation rather than affection. "Of course," she said. "Whatever you need." We set sail for Miami that afternoon, the weather cooperating with picture-perfect conditions that felt almost mockingly idyllic given the circumstances. As the islands receded behind us, I made a show of working intently on my laptop, occasionally asking Eliza for input on security protocols that were actually elaborate misdirections. What she didn't know, what I took care to ensure she couldn't see, was that I was actually transferring my assets to a new wallet with multi-signature protection, one that required approval from both my original hardware device and a secondary authentication method I'd established through a dedicated security firm years earlier, a precaution I'd set up during a particularly paranoid phase that now seemed like cosmic foresight. That evening, I suggested we anchor in a secluded cove for our last night at sea before reaching Miami. I opened an expensive bottle of champagne, proposing a toast to new beginnings and absolute trust. Words that tasted like ash, but which Eliza met with enthusiasm that seemed genuine enough to momentarily make me doubt my conclusions. But doubt evaporated when, thinking I was asleep, she slipped out of bed and spent 40 minutes on the satellite phone in hushed, urgent conversation I could just barely make out through the cabin wall. "Everything's on schedule. Yes, Miami tomorrow. The transfer will happen. Just be ready with your part." Morning brought the Miami skyline into view, and with it, the culmination of whatever endgame Eliza and Jason had planned. As we prepared to dock, I noticed Eliza checking her phone with increasing frequency, a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there during our idyllic island time. "Nervous about something?" I asked lightly, adjusting the boat's heading as we approached the marina. "What?" "No, just checking the weather," she said, though the sky above us was crystalline blue without a cloud in sight. We docked without incident, the familiar process of securing lines and connecting shore power giving me something concrete to focus on while my mind raced with contingency plans. As we prepared to disembark, Eliza received another text that caused her to inhale sharply. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Perfect," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I just remembered. Jason mentioned he might be in Miami today, too. Such a coincidence, right? Maybe he could join us for dinner? The more the merrier, I agreed, matching her fake enthusiasm with my own. Why don't you invite him to meet us at the hotel? I've already booked the presidential suite at the Four Seasons. Thought we could celebrate in style before house hunting. Her eyes lit up at presidential suite in exactly the way they hadn't at the mention of Jason, and I felt a pang of something like grief for the person I'd thought she was. The hotel was everything you'd expect from a luxury Miami property, all marble surfaces and strategic floral arrangements designed to justify the astronomical room rate. The presidential suite occupied the top floor with panoramic views of the city and the bay beyond, the kind of space that makes you feel important simply by existing within it. As we entered, I made a show of being overcome with romantic intention, pulling Eliza into an embrace that she returned with professional enthusiasm. "I've been thinking," I murmured against her hair, "we should do the portfolio consolidation now, before dinner. Start our new chapter with complete financial transparency." I felt rather than saw her smile against my shoulder. "That sounds wonderful," she said, pulling back to meet my eyes with a convincing approximation of adoration. I retrieved my laptop and hardware wallet from my bag, setting them on the suite's expansive dining table with ceremonial precision. "I've already begun the process," I explained, turning the screen to show her a complex interface. "I just need to complete the final authorization, and everything will be secured in our new shared wallet." Eliza leaned in, her attention fixed on the screen with an intensity that had nothing to do with marital unity and everything to do with proximity to her objective. "It's all so technical," she said with manufactured humility. "I'm glad you understand this stuff. It's actually quite simple once you know what to look for," I replied, fingers moving across the keyboard in what appeared to be the process of transferring assets, but was actually activating a script I'd prepared the night before. Knock at the door interrupted the performance. "That must be room service," I said casually. "I ordered champagne. Would you mind getting it? I'm just at a critical point here." Eliza hesitated, clearly reluctant to step away from the laptop, but unable to justify refusing such a simple request. "Of course," she said, moving toward the door. The person on the other side, however, wasn't hotel staff. "Surprise!" came a male voice as the door swung open. I thought I'd come early, and the rest of Jason's sentence died as he registered my presence at the table, clearly not part of whatever scenario they had planned. I smiled blandly at his confusion. "Jason, what a coincidence. Eliza was just about to message you about dinner." I gestured to the laptop. "We're just finishing up some financial housekeeping first. Please, join us." The look that passed between them contained volumes of unspoken communication and not a small amount of panic. Jason recovered quickly, though, stepping into the suite with the confidence of someone accustomed to improvising. "Great to finally meet you, man," he said, extending his hand. "Eliza's told me so much about her new husband." "Funny," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "She's told me almost nothing about her old boyfriend." The silence that followed had texture and weight, like fog suddenly filling the room. "I don't know what you're talking about," Eliza said, but the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her. "Don't. You?" I turned the laptop to face them both, revealing not the wallet interface they expected, but a screen displaying their text message history, extracted from the USB drive the night before. I particularly enjoyed this exchange from the day before our chance meeting in Miami. Target profiles like the classic nouveau riche crypto bro, ego-driven, desperate for validation, easily manipulated through flattery and sexual attention. I looked up at Eliza. "Remarkably accurate assessment, though I'd like to think I'm slightly less predictable than your profile suggested." Jason's hand moved toward his jacket pocket in a way that suddenly made me question whether this confrontation had been my wisest move. "I wouldn't," I said quietly. "The presidential suite comes with a dedicated security team, and they're currently in the hallway outside this door. Plus, I've already moved all my assets to a wallet you can't access without biometric verification and multi-signature approval from my attorney. This, I gestured to the laptop, was never going to work. Eliza's composed facade cracked, frustration bleeding through. You followed me, in St. Thomas. I did, I acknowledged. Though, to be fair, you were planning to rob me, so perhaps we can call it even on the trust violations. It wasn't personal, she said, which was possibly the most painful part of the entire charade. Clearly, I agreed. Just business, right? Find lonely crypto-millionaire, seduce, marry, extract assets, disappear. Quite the operation you two have. I imagine I'm not the first? Jason's expression confirmed my suspicion. They'd done this before, probably multiple times with varying approaches tailored to each mark's specific vulnerabilities. What happens now? Jason asked, his tone suggesting he was already calculating escape routes. That depends entirely on you, I replied, closing the laptop. Option 1. I call the police, provide them with the evidence I've already forwarded to my attorney, and you both face charges for conspiracy to commit fraud, among other things. Option 2, you leave now, never contact me again, and I don't pursue legal action. Why would you offer option 2? Eliza asked, genuine confusion in her voice. I looked at her, really looked at her, remembering the moments that had felt real despite everything. The Nautilus shell, the way she'd explained complex concepts with infectious enthusiasm, the laughter that had seemed too genuine to be fabricated. Because despite everything, I don't think either of us needs more complications, I said finally, and because I'd like to believe there were moments of authenticity, even if the overall context was false. Something flickered across her face, regret, perhaps, or just expert simulation of it. There were, she said softly. More than I expected. Jason made a sound of disbelief or disgust. We should go, he said to Eliza, already moving toward the door. She hesitated, eyes still on mine, and for a breath I wondered if there was something else she wanted to say, some explanation or apology or even a different kind of truth. But then she nodded, removed the makeshift ring from her finger, and placed it gently on the table between us. The Nautilus really was beautiful, she said. I meant that. And then they were gone, leaving me alone in a ridiculously oversized hotel suite with a bottle of champagne meant for a celebration that would never happen. I should have felt devastated. Perhaps in a different version of this story, I would have been the humiliated victim of an elaborate confidence scheme, left to nurse wounds of both heart and ego. But as I stood looking out over the Miami skyline, watching boats much like mine crossing the bay below, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because I'd caught them before they could steal my assets, though that was certainly preferable to the alternative. Not even because I'd avoided legal entanglements that would have been messy and public. No, the relief came from something more fundamental. The realization that the connection I thought we'd shared, however manufactured on her part, had shown me something important about myself. I was capable of openness, of vulnerability, of the kind of partnership I'd always claimed to want, but had never really risked pursuing. The fact that Eliza had been playing a role didn't negate the person I'd been with her, someone more authentic and present than I'd allowed myself to be in years. The irony wasn't lost on me. It had taken a con artist to bring out my most genuine self. 6 months later, I'm back in Austin, living in a house rather than a yacht, though I kept the boat, renamed now to Due Diligence. My crypto portfolio has diversified significantly, with the majority converted to more traditional assets, a hedge against both market volatility and future con artists with expensive tastes. I still think about Eliza sometimes, not with anger or even regret, but with a kind of detached curiosity. I wonder which parts of her were real, if any. I wonder what series of choices led her to a life of elaborate deception, and whether she ever considers the people left in her wake. Mostly, though, I think about the Nautilus shell and what it represents, the perfect mathematical spiral, each chamber larger than the last while maintaining the same fundamental proportions. Growth without distortion. Evolution without loss of identity. I keep the improvised ring she returned in a small box on my desk, not as a romantic memento, but as a reminder of two important truths: that people are rarely who they present themselves to be, and that sometimes the most valuable investments yield returns you never anticipated. As for Trump Token, I liquidated my position entirely the day after Eliza and Jason disappeared, converting the proceeds into a donor-advised fund focused on digital literacy and financial education for vulnerable populations. There's a pleasing symmetry in using profits from weaponized misinformation to fund its antidote. Life continues its unpredictable spiral. I date occasionally, approach relationships with a healthy dose of skepticism tempered by deliberate openness, and make it a point to verify romantic interests through multiple independent sources before sharing details of my wallet security protocols. And sometimes, on clear evenings when the Texas sky performs its spectacular sunset routine, I take a moment to appreciate the strange, twisted path that led me here. Wealthier in some ways, poorer in others, but ultimately richer in the kind of wisdom you can't acquire through any token, no matter how dramatically it appreciates.